On a cold winter night, Emily found herself home alone for the very first time. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving her with the comforting presence of her loyal golden retriever, Max. Emily felt both excited and nervous, enjoying the independence but also keenly aware of the unsettling quiet that comes with being alone. She carefully locked all the doors and windows in the house, except for one, the window in her bedroom that never seemed to close all the way, no matter how hard she tried. She shrugged it off, figuring that the cold wind outside wouldn't make it past her thick curtains. As she settled into bed, Max curled up at her feet, and she let the soft murmur of the evening news keep her company. The anchor's voice grew serious, warning viewers about a dangerous individual who had been spotted in the area. Emily's nerves kicked in as she listened to the report, which urged people to stay alert and secure their homes. Shivering slightly, she double-checked the lock on her bedroom door before slipping under the covers. Sleep came in short bursts, but around midnight, a strange dripping sound pulled her from her uneasy slumber. Groggy and confused, she listened for a moment, her heartbeat quickening. The noise echoed faintly, its source unclear. She told herself it was nothing, just the plumbing or maybe a leaky faucet. Trying to reassure herself, she reached down from her bed to give Max a comforting pat. Feeling the warm touch of his tongue against her fingers calmed her, and she lay back down. The dripping sound persisted, however, nagging at her until she could no longer ignore it. Determined to find the source, Emily slid out of bed and tiptoed through the dark house. She checked the taps in the kitchen, the bathroom, even the laundry room. Nothing was leaking. Puzzled, she returned to her room, her fear creeping back. She reached out to Max once again, feeling that familiar lick, and the steady rhythm of the dripping noise lulled her back into a fitful sleep. Morning light streamed through her bedroom window, waking her abruptly. She stretched, trying to shake off the eerie feelings from the night before. Calling for Max, she expected him to hop up, tail wagging as usual. But he didn't. "Max?" she called out again, more urgently. No response. Her stomach knotted with worry. Panicking now, she searched the house, calling for her dog. Her voice grew more frantic with every step. She checked under the bed, the living room, and finally moved toward the closet, her last hope. As she opened the door, Emily's world froze. There, hanging upside down, was Max's lifeless body, blood dripping slowly onto the floor in a steady rhythm. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and shaking. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror, when something else caught her attention. Written on the inside of the closet door in smeared red letters was a chilling message: "Humans can lick too." The horrifying realization gripped her. The comforting licks she'd felt during the night hadn't come from Max at all. Her skin crawled and her heart raced as she frantically dialed 911, her hands trembling so violently she could barely press the buttons. As she waited for help to arrive, the house no longer felt like her home. It felt like a cage, one where something sinister had entered unnoticed. And as the sirens echoed in the distance, Emily was haunted by the truth. Whatever had been in her room that night hadn't left. It was still out there, watching, waiting for the next moment she let her guard down. It was a little past midnight, and the long stretch of road seemed to stretch endlessly under the man's headlights. The sky was an inky black, with only the occasional flicker of stars, and the trees on either side of the road stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. He had been driving for hours, his mind wandering, when he spotted something ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. As his car drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, barely in her 20s, dressed in a beautiful white dress. She stood in the dim glow of a street lamp, her thumb out in the universal gesture for a hitchhike. The man hesitated for a moment. It wasn't often he picked up strangers, especially this late at night, but there was something about her, an air of innocence, maybe, or perhaps it was the lonely look in her eyes. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled over. The girl approached the car with a soft smile, her white dress fluttering slightly in the breeze. She had long, dark hair that framed her pale face, and her eyes sparkled in the moonlight. "Need a ride?" the man asked, rolling down the window. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice soft and melodic. "I'm trying to get home." She slid into the passenger seat, and they set off down the quiet road. The car's interior filled with the faint scent of lilacs, though the man couldn't quite place where the smell was coming from. As they drove, they struck up a conversation, talking about everything from music to places they had traveled. She had a charming way about her, effortlessly keeping the conversation flowing, and the man found himself drawn to her despite the odd circumstances. When they reached her home, a quaint old house at the edge of town, she thanked him warmly and stepped out of the car. She waved as she walked up the path to the front door, and he watched her until she disappeared inside. He thought no more of it as he drove off into the night, feeling oddly pleased with the encounter. But the next morning, as he got into his car to head to work, he noticed something in the passenger seat. A light gray sweater. It was delicate, soft, and clearly belonged to the girl he had given a ride the night before. She must have forgotten it in her hurry to get home, he thought. Deciding to be a gentleman, he made a mental note to return it to her on his way to work. Later that day, he found himself driving back toward her house. It wasn't far out of the way, and he figured it would be a quick stop. He pulled up to the house and rang the doorbell, the sweater folded neatly in his hand. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her face lined with age and her hair tied in a loose bun. "Good afternoon," the man began, offering a polite smile. "I gave a young lady a ride last night, your daughter, I believe, and she left this sweater in my car." The old woman's expression changed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him with a puzzled frown. "You must be mistaken," she said slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "No, I'm sure of it," the man insisted. "She told me this was her home. I dropped her off here late last night. She was wearing a white dress, and we had a really nice conversation. She left this sweater behind." The old woman's face paled at his words, and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the door. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at him as if she were seeing something that wasn't there. "I'm sorry," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "but you're mistaken. My daughter, she passed away 2 years ago." The man blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "I just saw her last night. She was sitting right here in my car." The old woman's eyes filled with sadness as she stepped back from the door, shaking her head slowly. "My daughter was killed in a car accident on this very road 2 years ago. She used to hitchhike home from her friend's place. It was a rainy night, and the driver, he didn't see her in time." Her voice cracked as she spoke. She never made it home. The man felt the blood drain from his face. His hands shook as he glanced down at the sweater in his hand, the delicate fabric now feeling like lead in his grip. His mind raced. How could this be possible? He had spoken to her. She had been real as any other person he had ever met. They had talked, laughed, and he had dropped her off at this very house. "That can't be right," he whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. She was. She was real. The old woman gave him a long, sorrowful look before gently closing the door, leaving him standing there on the doorstep, the eerie weight of her words pressing down on him. He stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, his mind spinning in disbelief. Slowly, he turned and walked back to his car, the sweater still clutched in his hands. The drive to work was a blur, the road seeming to stretch on endlessly before him. But all he could think about was the girl in the white dress, the girl who couldn't have been there. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to make sense of what had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cemetery he had passed on his way home, the one not far from the house where he had dropped her off. Could it be possible? Could she have been a ghost? Unable to sleep, he got up and dressed, driven by a strange compulsion to return to that road. The night was eerily silent as he drove, the trees casting long shadows across the deserted street. He parked near the cemetery and got out, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The gate to the cemetery creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the rows of gravestones. He wandered among them, his heart racing, until he found what he was looking for, a simple headstone, weathered and worn, with a name that made his blood run cold. It was her name, the girl in the white dress. The date on the stone confirmed it. She had died exactly 2 years ago to the day. He stood there, staring at the grave, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought of the old woman's words, the sadness in her eyes, and the sweater still lying on the passenger seat of his car. A chill ran down his spine as the realization settled in. He had given a ride to a ghost. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and for just a moment he thought he heard a voice. A soft, familiar voice, thanking him for the ride. Dolores had always been a girl with a flair for the dramatic. Her giant beehive hairdo was her crown, a statement of her individuality that she maintained with almost obsessive devotion. After graduating high school, she moved into a small, cramped apartment, thrilled at the prospect of living alone for the first time. But the thrill quickly faded as she struggled to pay rent and buy groceries. Still, she made sure to set aside a few bucks for her hair, her pride and joy. Every week, she would visit her hairstylist, Gina, who spent hours perfecting the towering masterpiece atop Dolores's head. "You've got to keep it healthy," Gina would remind her. "No washing too often, use this special spray, and never sleep on your back." Dolores followed the instructions meticulously, convinced that her hairdo was her ticket to popularity, beauty, and maybe even love. But one morning, just as the sun's rays filtered through her thin curtains, Dolores awoke with an unbearable itch at her scalp. She scratched frantically, wincing as a sharp pain pierced her skin. It felt as though a fire ant had made a home in her hair, and panic began to set in. After a quick inspection in the mirror, she was horrified to discover red, swollen bumps dotting her scalp. Desperate to find relief, Dolores turned to home remedies. She tried everything: tea tree oil, vinegar rinses, even aloe vera gel. Yet, the itch only worsened, spreading down her neck and into her ears. After a sleepless night, she finally realized the culprit: a spider bite. Gritting her teeth, she called an exterminator, convinced that the issue was a spider infestation. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," the exterminator reassured her, spraying a thick mist around her apartment. But after he left, the pain persisted, and Dolores found herself sobbing in frustration. "What now?" she muttered to herself. Her hair was beginning to feel like a curse. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stormed out of her apartment, determined to visit Gina for immediate help. The salon buzzed with chatter and laughter as she pushed through the door, but her heart sank when she saw the line of clients waiting for attention. "Dolores! Wait your turn!" Gina called from across the room, but Dolores was having none of it. In a moment of impulsive rage, she shoved a middle-aged woman from the salon chair. "I need you now!" she declared, her voice shaking with desperation. Gina looked shocked but grabbed her tools and moved toward Dolores. "You really shouldn't." But Dolores couldn't hear her over the roaring sound of her own heartbeat. As Gina began to unwrap the beehive, a sudden chill swept through the salon. Dolores felt something crawling on her neck. She flinched but couldn't bring herself to look. The world around her faded, and she was consumed by the anticipation of relief. Then horror struck. A black widow spider scuttled down her cheek, followed by another and another. Panic erupted in the salon as clients shrieked and scrambled for the exits. Gina stumbled back, her hands trembling as she dropped her comb. "Oh my God, Dolores!" The beehive hairdo, once her pride, now became a grotesque nest. The spiders poured out in waves, black and glossy against her pale skin. Dolores sat frozen in the chair, her eyes wide with terror, as more spiders spilled over her face, their tiny legs tickling her skin with a sinister purpose. In the chaos, the hairspray and product meant to protect her now served as a suffocating cocoon, trapping the creatures within. It became a macabre scene as the hairspray glistened under the fluorescent lights, a sticky trap for the black widows that had taken up residence in her scalp. Gina, horrified, tried to yank Dolores out of the chair, but it was too late. The beehive collapsed and the spiders scattered across the floor, filling every corner of the salon. Clients were screaming, chairs were overturned, and mirrors shattered as everyone rushed for the exit, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. Dolores's heart raced as she felt the swarm enveloping her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. Instead, she sat paralyzed, an unwilling host to the horrors crawling beneath her once majestic hairdo. Gina finally turned back, her face pale with terror, and the sight before her was enough to haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Dolores's scalp was a grotesque landscape, half-eaten by the hungry black widows, their tiny bodies writhing in the mess of hair and skin. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Dolores was not just suffering, she was a living nightmare. In the end, Dolores's desperate pursuit of beauty had led her to a horrifying fate. The salon, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, transformed into a scene from a horror film, a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of even the most glamorous facades. And as the screams faded into the night, the beehive that had once defined her beauty became her tomb, a silent testament to the price of vanity. In the heart of a bustling college campus, two best friends, Meg and Samantha, shared a small dormitory room that held countless late-night study sessions and whispered secrets. Their bond was unbreakable, each relying on the other to navigate the tumultuous waters of college life. As midterm exams approached, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Meg was determined to excel, while Samantha felt the pull of social obligations. One Friday night, Samantha received an invitation to a party. "You should come with me," she urged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I can't," Meg replied, her voice firm yet laced with disappointment. "I have to study. These exams are important." "Fine, but I'll be back early," Samantha promised, grabbing her jacket and rushing out the door, leaving Meg surrounded by textbooks and highlighters. The night wore on, and Meg buried herself in her notes, the quiet hum of the dorm a comforting backdrop. Meanwhile, Samantha danced and laughed, losing herself in the rhythm of the party, unaware of the dark shadows lurking beyond her cheerful demeanor. When she finally returned to the dormitory, she noticed the lights were off. "Meg must be asleep," she whispered to herself, careful not to disturb her friend. She tiptoed past the common area, her heart still racing from the excitement of the night, and opened the door to their room. The darkness enveloped her, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine as she reached for her bedside lamp. But she hesitated. Meg had always been sensitive to light when sleeping, so Samantha opted to leave it off. Early the next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Samantha woke with a start, her mind buzzing with thoughts of their impending exams. She turned to Meg, ready to discuss study plans, but her friend lay unusually still. "Meg, wake up! We need to go over the material," Samantha called, shaking her friend gently. There was no response. A pit formed in her stomach as she leaned closer, brushing Meg's hair away from her face. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Meg's face was an unsettling shade of black and blue, her features twisted in an unnatural way. Samantha recoiled in horror, stumbling back and crashing to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. "Oh my God, no! Meg!" she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a frantic storm of confusion and dread. Samantha's gaze darted around the room, taking in the chaos. Meg's study table was a mess. Papers scattered, books thrown to the side as if someone had been searching for something. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as she noticed something peculiar on the wall. With trembling hands, Samantha stood and approached the note, her heart racing. It was scrawled in a jagged handwriting that sent shivers down her spine. "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?" The realization hit her like a freight train. The murderer had been in the room with Meg while she was studying, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Samantha felt a wave of nausea crash over her as she pieced together the horrifying puzzle. A scream bubbled up inside her, desperate to escape, but it was swallowed by the enormity of the situation. She could hardly breathe as the truth settled in her gut. She had been so close, so unaware. Panic set in as she stumbled back from the wall, frantically reaching for her phone. She dialed 911, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. The operator's voice cut through her haze, but the words felt distant, muffled by the reality of what had just occurred. As she waited for help to arrive, every noise in the room felt amplified. The rustle of her clothes, the thumping of her heart, the sound of her shallow breaths. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone, that the darkness that had consumed her friend still lingered, waiting to strike again. Samantha collapsed on the floor, the weight of grief and fear crushing her. How could this happen? How could she have been so oblivious? The memories of laughter and late-night talks flooded her mind, only to be shattered by the grim reality of the moment. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, paralyzed by shock, until the sound of sirens pierced the silence. The flashing lights illuminated the hallway outside, bringing with them the promise of help and the horror of the truth. When the authorities finally entered the room, they found Samantha huddled in the corner, her face pale and haunted. They moved quickly, assessing the scene, their trained eyes catching every detail. The words on the wall were examined, the mess cataloged, and Meg's lifeless form was handled with the utmost care. Samantha watched through a haze of disbelief as they worked, feeling as if she were in a nightmare from which she could not wake. The realization that the darkness had infiltrated their lives, that a predator had lurked in their sanctuary, left a scar on her soul. The police asked her questions, their voices echoing in her mind, but all she could think of was Meg, her laughter, her dreams, their friendship. The world around her faded into a blur as the reality of loss settled in, leaving behind a hollow ache that would never truly heal. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on the room that had once held so many memories, Samantha understood that this day would forever be etched in her mind. It was the day her life changed irreversibly, the day darkness seeped into the light, leaving only shadows behind. The cold wind howled against the windows as the group of girls huddled together in the dimly lit living room. It was a typical sleepover. Snacks, gossip, and ghost stories to pass the time while their friends' parents were out for the night. The house, old and creaky, seemed the perfect setting for a spooky night, but none of them could have anticipated how real the horror would become. "So, did you guys hear about the cemetery nearby?" One of the girls, Sarah, began in a low voice. Her face was barely visible in the flickering light of a single candle they had lit for dramatic effect. The girls exchanged glances, curiosity piqued. "What about it?" Jenna, the most skeptical among them, asked, her tone laced with doubt. "There's a grave there," Sarah continued, her voice almost a whisper now, "where they say a man was buried alive just last month. People have reported hearing strange sounds at night, like someone trying to claw their way out of a coffin." The group shivered, more from the suggestion than the chill in the air. The idea of someone trapped underground, helpless and suffocating, stirred their imaginations. One of the younger girls, Emily, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. "Come on," Jenna scoffed, rolling her eyes. "That's just an urban legend. You really believe that?" "I don't know," said another girl, nervously twirling a strand of her hair. "My brother said he heard something when he walked by the cemetery last week, like scratching and voices." "That's ridiculous," Jenna replied firmly. "There's no such thing as ghosts, and no one is buried alive these days. It's all just to scare people like you." Sarah smirked. "Well, if you don't believe it, why don't you prove it?" Jenna paused, sensing a challenge. "What do you mean?" "I dare you to go to the cemetery," Sarah said, leaning in closer, her eyes glinting with mischief. Go to the grave of the man who's supposedly buried alive and drive a stake into the ground above his coffin. If there's no ghost, you've got nothing to worry about, right?" The room fell silent as the dare hung in the air. Jenna's lips tightened, and she could feel everyone's eyes on her. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not from Sarah, who loved to test her. "Fine," Jenna said after a moment, standing up. "I'll do it. I'll show you how ridiculous this whole thing is." Her friends exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Jenna was bold, but none of them liked the idea of her going to the cemetery alone. But before anyone could protest, she was already grabbing her coat. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, Jenna called over her shoulder as she walked toward the door. "Try not to get too scared while I'm gone." The wind was colder than she'd expected, biting through her clothes as she made her way through the deserted streets toward the cemetery. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The further she walked, the darker it became, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that danced in the moonlight. When she reached the cemetery gates, they creaked open with an eerie groan. Jenna hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to stop her. But the streets behind her were empty. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cemetery was old, its gravestones weathered and leaning, their inscriptions faded and barely legible. The air here was still, unnaturally so, and the only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel path. The moon cast a pale glow over the rows of graves, but it offered little comfort. As she approached the grave Sarah had mentioned, she could feel her heart beating faster. The grave was freshly dug, the earth still loose and disturbed. For a moment she thought she heard something, a faint scraping noise from deep beneath the soil, but she quickly dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks on her. Jenna pulled out the stake she had brought, a crude wooden thing she'd found in the shed behind the house, and knelt by the grave. Her breath fogged the air as she gripped the stake in both hands and prepared to drive it into the ground. "This is stupid," she muttered to herself, feeling a wave of embarrassment. "There's nothing here." But as she raised the stake to plunge it into the soil, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. She could have sworn she heard something again. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of scratching, of nails clawing at wood. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to finish the dare. She drove the stake into the ground, pushing it deep into the soil above the grave. As soon as the wood pierced the earth, the wind stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the cemetery. For a moment, nothing happened. Jenna stood up, her heart racing, waiting for something, anything to confirm her doubts. But there was only silence, cold and oppressive. "See?" she said aloud, though her voice sounded shaky. "Nothing." But as she turned to leave, she felt something tug at her coat. Panic surged through her, and she spun around, but there was no one there. The wind had picked up again, swirling leaves around her feet, and in that moment, she realized with horror that she had made a terrible mistake. She tried to move, but her feet wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding her in place, pulling her down toward the grave. She looked down in terror to see that the hem of her coat was caught on the stake she had driven into the ground. In her haste to finish the dare, she had impaled her coat along with the soil. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to free herself, but the more she pulled, the more tangled she became. She fell to her knees, frantically trying to tear the fabric loose, but it was no use. The panic clawed at her throat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then she heard it. A low, guttural voice, like a whisper carried on the wind, drifted up from beneath the ground. Challenge accepted. Jenna's scream was swallowed by the night. Morning came slowly, the sun casting long shadows over the cemetery as it rose. Sarah, Emily, and the others had waited all night for Jenna to return, but as dawn broke and there was still no sign of her, they knew something was wrong. With growing dread, they decided to go to the cemetery to find her. When they arrived, the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. Jenna lay sprawled on the ground next to the grave, her face pale and lifeless. The wooden stake was driven through her coat and into the earth, but what made their stomachs turn was the position of the stake. It had pierced her chest, driven straight through her heart. Sarah fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached for the stake, and that's when she saw it. Carved into the wood, in small, jagged letters, were the words, "Challenge accepted." None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They could only stare in horror at the tragic proof that some dares were never meant to be accepted. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.